the Fair Labor Standards Act is a federal law that establishes that employees in the private sector, as well as federal, state, and local governments, it sets their minimum wage, it regulates their overtime pay, it determines their record keeping, and it sets regulations for youth employment. We're going to be going over youth employment today. We're going to kind of stick to the first three topics here. But the Fair Labor Standards Act does not regulate vacation pay, sick pay, or holiday pay. You as the employer would determine if you want to pay these things. There may be state laws on in certain states that require you to pay sick pay based on state laws, but in terms of this federal law, it does not regulate those types of leaves. And then break times. There's also not a federal law on providing break times to employees. But there are some states that have laws. For example, in the state of Tennessee, if an hourly employee works 6 hours, they're entitled to a 30-minute unpaid lunch break. But lots of states don't have that regulation. So again, depending on your state, it may be up to the employer as to whether or not they want to provide these breaks. One of the things that comes up, and I just wanted to kind of briefly talk about this as well, one of the things that comes up about the Fair Labor Standards Act is who has to comply with it. And if you look up the regulations, it basically says organizations that take in $500,000 worth of sales or money per year, but also organizations who deal in interstate commerce. And that is a very broad term. Some courts have ruled that interstate commerce could be accepting mail, United States mail from other states. It could be ordering office supplies from online that comes from another state. So in general, I would say all employers need to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act. The only organizations or the only employers who are explicitly exempt are a few small family farms that don't rely on any sort of outside labor. So I would say in general, you are probably going to have to comply with this law. So this regulation classifies employees into two categories. You have what you call a non-exempt employee, which would essentially be your hourly staff. Those are employees that are paid on an hourly basis. They are entitled to the rights under FLSA in terms of their weekly pay, in terms of hourly pay, in terms of overtime worked within a work week. And we'll talk about that a little later on as well. And then you have your exempt staff, and this is going to be your salaried staff. And those are employees who have to make a minimum of $684 per week on a salary basis. And then they also have to qualify for exemption under FLSA based on their job description and their job duties. So there are specific exemptions that positions can fall under. There's a professional exemption, which is an example of someone who needs a degree, a higher level degree to do their job. Doctors, lawyers, things like that. There is an administrative exemption, and I know the term administrative may be misleading. It's not your administrative assistants or things like that. This is administrative in the sense of they are doing duties within the office, and their duties have a direct correlation to the financial security of the organization. It has a direct, they have decision-making capabilities, high-level decision-making capabilities. So this would be, your managers who have direct reports. So this would be your accountants, people who are making decisions on a day-to-day basis that could directly impact the company. So when you look at making an employee an exempt or non-exempt, you really have to nail down the duties. You're going to want to be familiar with the exemptions and look at the job description of the individual and then look at them on a case-by-case basis. But again, to be exempt, your job has to fall under an exemption category, and you also have to be paid $684 a week on a salary basis. So if you have someone who is a decision maker and, but they make $30,000 a year, you just can't make them salaried because they don't meet that salary threshold. That $684 works out to about $36,000 a year. So in terms of your hourly staff members, these are individuals who are paid on an hourly basis. They have to be paid for all compensable time. And this includes any time they are required to give their employer their work time. Even if they're not exerting anything physical or mental, they are still paid. So for example, if your receptionist is sitting at the desk in your office and she's taking calls, and maybe she has an hour between calls and she has no other work to do, she's just sitting there, maybe she has her phone or whatever you allow her to do in her downtime, you still have to pay her because she's available to you and sitting at her desk, even if she's not actively answering phone calls. This also includes working from home, and this is something that you have to be very, very careful of. If you have an hourly staff member, and right now we're all kind of at home, some people may be back in the office, but if an employee is at home and they're checking email or taking calls, you have to pay them for that time. And the best rule of thumb is to set a precedent that employees who are hourly are expected to not work off the clock. They cannot work when they're clocked out at all, and that includes checking email. If they have it on their phone, they may be inclined to just check it continuously throughout the evening. They may respond back to you late in the evening if you send them an email. But the expectation should be that hourly staff members cannot work off the clock, because even if they don't have your approval to do that, if you know they're working and they are performing work, you still have to pay them. Even if it's overtime that's not approved, if you're aware that they're working, you do have to pay them. So as an expectation, you should communicate to managers if they're getting emails after hours, or if they're getting work product first thing in the morning that person obviously couldn't have done between when they clocked in and when they sent it. They need to be looking for those things and then addressing that as that comes up, because we're going to talk later on about how costly violating this law can be. And so what you want to do is kind of set the expectation that you follow this law and you are going to be complying with it, and employees should do the same. Now, some people have staff that travel who are not exempt or hourly. So, for example, around annual conference time for a lot of the conferences, your non-exempt staff may travel. Travel time is compensable. Now, the time from when an employee leaves their home to when they go to their home office, their work office, that's not compensable. That's your normal commute. But really, any travel outside of that normal commute time is compensable. So if you have an individual who is going to annual conference and they're expected to be at work functions, they're expected to be at work dinners, even if they, are just kind of going to dinner and they're sitting around, they could be talking about work, they could not be. If they are expected to be there, it's not voluntary, they have to be there. They should be compensated for that time. Now, if they were to go to their hotel room, for example, and at the end of the night and have some downtime, you wouldn't necessarily have to pay them for that. But if they are working, it does have to be tracked in terms of their hourly work. And they do have to be paid, and they would have to be paid overtime based on that. So just some things to consider. And as we go through this, again, I'm going very high level, discussing the regulations, but if you have a specific employee or a specific instance, best practices would be to reach out to an employment attorney to get clarification, or if it's just more of a general question about practices or policies, Caitlin or I can assist with that. So for non-exempt employees, overtime is any time worked over 40 hours in a week in terms of FLSA. So the employee is required to keep track of their work hours if they are hourly. So this includes a timesheet. Best practices would be that they clock in and out so you're getting the most accurate record of their time. But what you want to do at minimum is have them track their clock in and out times on a timesheet. You don't want them saying 8 hours, 8 hours, 8 hours a day. You want them saying 8:15 to 4:30 when they clocked out for lunch, and keeping the best records you can of when they were performing work. And their overtime is determined on a defined work week. So within your organization, you should have a designated work week that cannot change week to week. It has to be set. You can't change it based on someone's work schedule to make sure they don't get overtime. Typically, Monday through Sunday, Sunday through Saturday, however you designate your work week. And then the hours they work within that work week determine overtime. So if they work 40 hours within the work week, they would be paid their regular rate of pay. Any hours over 40 are time and a half. A lot of times you will see different organizations within the connection who have a lower work week. Maybe they may have a 35-hour work week, and that's fine. So if you have individuals who work over 35 hours, you don't have to pay them overtime until they hit 40. So again, 40 is that cutoff, even if your standard work week is 35, 36, something like that. It's not tracked within a day. Some states, I know California has some different laws, but in general, the overtime is only based on work week. So if someone works a 10-hour workday, you wouldn't have to pay them overtime until they hit that 40 hours within that work week. And so I think it's a best practice to clarify this to employees. If you have a policy that states what your work week is, that individuals are expected to comply or work with their normal schedule. Overtime is paid for any hours worked over 40 hours within that work week. That is a best practice, and that shows you're doing your due diligence. You can require that employees receive approval prior to working designated overtime. However, if they don't get approval and they do work overtime, you still have to pay them for that. You can't have a rule that says if you don't get approved overtime, then you won't be paid overtime for your hours that you worked. You cannot do that. You have to pay them if you know they're working, but you could go the route of disciplinary action and say, I noticed you have 42 hours this week. That's 2 hours of overtime. You did not get prior approval. You're expected to comply with company policy and get prior approval before working overtime. You could say that for your standard work week too, even if you don't go into overtime hours. That our designated work week is 37 hours. You work 38, you have to get prior approval to go over your scheduled work week. But that being said, again, if a non-exempt employee works over 40 hours in a work week, they get time and a half. Some mistakes that are commonly made, sometimes people say, if you work over a certain amount of hours in a day, we're going to pay you a flat rate for, any hours worked over after 5 p.m. That is not a best practice. You cannot do that. You have to track their hours in terms of a work week and pay time and a half for any hours over 40. So just some things to look for. Just be aware that if an employee is not meeting their deadlines or they have a lot of work to do, they may be tempted to work off the clock. So that is just something that the best practice that you can have is to communicate to staff. They're not allowed to do that. They have to clock all of their time. Managers should be looking out for those late night emails, or just be aware that if their employees clocked out, they don't need to be working. If they are, they just want to go above and beyond. They just want to volunteer their time because we're the church and they just out of the goodness of their heart want to volunteer their time and work off the clock. They cannot do that. Absolutely not. You just have to keep an eye out for that. And again, communicate to employees that is not okay. Employees who are being disciplined for poor performance may be tempted to work off the clock, to take things home with them or to do things after hours. But again, you've got to keep an eye out for those things because they cannot do that. So again, the FLSA doesn't require meal breaks or meal periods as a federal law. Again, some states may require meal breaks. Now, one of the things that the FLSA does say is that if you give an employee a break and make them clock out, that break has to be over 20 minutes. Generally, the Fair Labor Standards Act says if you give an employee a 15-minute break, that's not considered a bona fide meal break. And so you would have to pay them for that break time because that's not enough time for them to truly step away and take their time, eat their lunch or whatever they need to do. So general rule of thumb is that a break time of 20 minutes or less would be paid. And if you do give them a longer break, then it can be unpaid and they would need to clock out for that. But you do not need to ask employees to work during unpaid breaks. So if they are clocked out, eating their lunch, and they're not working, they don't need to be checking work emails, taking work-related calls, don't work while eating if they are clocked out. And again, all of this pertains to hourly staff members. For exempt staff, salaried staff, that's a whole different ballgame. But for the hourly staff members, if they're eating lunch at their desk, they're going to be tempted if their manager calls them. They're going to be tempted to answer the phone. If somebody walks up to their desk and asks them a question, they're going to be tempted to answer that and do work-related activities on their breaks. So, generally, if you are in the office and you have a break room, I would encourage employees to go there so that they can truly step away and have their lunch break uninterrupted. Or if they need to leave the work site, that's fine too. But you just want to set the expectation that they are not to be working during their break time if they're clocked out. So when it comes to responsibility, supervisors are responsible for ensuring that all compensable work time is accurately recorded. A best practice is to have employees track their timesheet, then have the supervisor sign off on it, just so they can make sure it's complete. They can make sure any time off is documented appropriately. They can make sure if they got an email from an employee at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday that they actually have that time recorded. Managers should understand the expectations for exempt or non-exempt and which employees they have are classified as each. So it may be that if you have an executive assistant who is hourly, they're not expected to check their email at home because they're off the clock, but maybe they know if something urgent happens, if their manager texts them and says, hey, I really need your help, they can clock in and work and then clock back out or log their time appropriately. But the expectation is not that they're always on, they're always checking their email for their manager's communications. They need to know kind of if they are in a position where they may have an urgent situation, how is the manager going to get a hold of them so that they're not sitting there watching their email all the time. And then make sure non-exempt employees, if they are allowed under your company policy or based on your state law, if they're given a lunch break, make sure that's uninterrupted, and the managers should know, hey, if it's lunchtime, I'm to leave that employee unless it's urgent, then they must clock back in. If something comes up, they can clock back in, we'll pay them for that time. But it's really about the culture of the workplace and the understanding that when hourly staff members are off the clock, they are truly off the clock and not working. And then again, when it comes to employee time cards, if managers do approve those, they just need to kind of take the time to review them, make sure everything is accurate, make sure that, employees did log their time appropriately, that they're not working at home. And again, your best practice is to do your due diligence and have a company policy that outlines all of this so that employees understand they are to be compensated for all work time, regardless of when they do it or where, for hourly staff members. And then if someone does realize, like, let's say your employee comes to you and says, hey, I forgot to clock back in from lunch on this day, so I was only paid for a half day and I worked a full day. You want to make sure you're remedying those situations quickly. So if a manager becomes aware of that, they need to reach out to human resources or payroll or whoever is over that administrative function to make sure that employee gets paid on that next check or the following check as soon as you are made aware. That's why employees reviewing their own time card is a best practice, just to make sure they didn't miss anything, especially if you're punching in and out electronically, because that's very easy to do. So employees are responsible for accurately reporting the time worked. They should notify their supervisor if they've not been paid correctly. And again, this is a training and policy issue. They should know what to do if they do realize they've been not paid correctly. Your payroll system, your payroll work week is going to determine that overtime. That should be pretty automatic in terms of how you log their hours. But then again, they are responsible for not working during unpaid meal breaks. And they're responsible if they are interrupted and they do have to start working again, they should clock back in. Employees should not clock in and out for one another. A lot of places have policies that say if you falsify your time card, then it could result in disciplinary action or termination. And so if an employee is clocking in and out for another employee, that's not an accurate record, especially if it's electronic. So the best practice is the employee logs their own time, clocks in and out for themselves, and they're responsible for accurately reporting their time. So why is this important? So the Fair Labor Standards Act, it is very easy if an employee feels like they've been unpaid continuously or they've been paid incorrectly. It's very easy for these types of lawsuits to turn into collective action lawsuits. If the employee goes to the Department of Labor and they say, I believe my employer's not been paying me correctly, maybe they designated me as salaried and I do not feel I'm salaried, I think my position's hourly, the Department of Labor could come in They could look at that position. If they determine that that is an hourly position, they're going to ask that employee to estimate how much overtime they've worked in the past 3 years, 2 years, depending on the employer's role in that. And then that's it. The burden of proof is on the employer to show that employee wasn't working. And that's very hard to do with laptops and phones and all of the things we have, because someone could be typing in Word and working on a document. You don't have any record of that. You can't prove that they weren't working in Word at that time. So they could become costly very quickly. In 2018, the Department of Labor recovered $304 million in wages owed workers. And over the past 5 years, they've collected about $1.3 billion. So it is great for employees who are being truly mistreated and they are being, categorized in the wrong area. They're being told to work off the clock. If they come in and find out that employees have been directed to work off the clock, they're going to look back 3 years and they're going to have the employee estimate how much time they've worked off the clock and including overtime. And it's very difficult to prove otherwise. The best thing employers can do is have a standard policy. Here's what we do, here's what we don't do. If employees do work off the clock, they address it swiftly and appropriately to make it clear and document that employee is not allowed to do that again. And again, the employer has the burden of proof. It's very hard to prove that an employee wasn't working when they say they were, especially again, with everyone being at home or people being at home. So the best thing that you can do is have your payroll records in terms of the employees' start and end times of the day and their break times, and do your due diligence as an employer to make sure you're tracking that. So before we go to questions, I just want to reiterate for exempt staff, and I just want to talk about this briefly. If you designate a staff member as exempt, they are salaried, they get paid their standard salary, I think $684 a week is what I said, that's the minimum. If you do time off, vacation, sick time, things like that, I recommend doing half or whole day increments. If you start dinging your exempt staff and making them take an hour here, an hour there, you're basically treating them like hourly staff. You're not giving them the benefit of being exempt. They're losing out on that overtime. So it's a trade-off. They're expected to work until they get their work completed. If they work a few less hours in a day or a few hours more in a day, it all evens out. They don't get the benefit of overtime. But you do not want to treat them like hourly staff and say, okay, you were gone for 30 minutes. We're going to have to take 30 minutes from your vacation bank. That is not a best practice. You're going to want to say, okay, if you're exempt and you work in a day, you can take your time off in half-day increments. Or, if you work 5 or 6 hours in a day, then you are considered paid for that day and you don't take time off. Or if you're going to be absent for an entire day, then you would take an entire day off. If they're on something like FMLA or an unpaid leave of absence, you can not pay them for full days if it's a bona fide leave of absence. But I would just recommend that you kind of look into the exempt status regulations too, because it's not just we can do whatever we want to because they're exempt. You have to give them the benefits of being exempt because they're missing out on the benefit of overtime. I believe that's all I have. Caitlin, do we have any questions?
We do not have any questions.
Oh, okay.
But I will say, Tricia, if you want to stop sharing your screen, if there's anybody that wants to ask any questions and wants to actually just talk, you can raise your hand in the chat, or you can go into the chat function. I know it was a lot of information that Tricia just covered, but as she mentioned, this is one of those areas where the lawsuits really are. It's the most costly, some of the most costly lawsuits, and when I say the Department of Labor does not care if we are a church or not. We've seen general agencies, annual conferences, and local churches impacted by this. So they have no hesitation about coming in and going through your files and looking at your time cards. So I see Susan has a question.
We actually had some weird stuff come up with ours because we're one of the conferences that actually has camps, and And so one issue that we had to deal with was, you know, some of the camps rely a lot on volunteers. And so we had to be really careful about what the volunteers were doing so that the volunteers weren't taking work away from paid employees that would be losing out on pay if they weren't doing that work. And so that got, you know, it wasn't anything major, but it was something that we had to look at and just make sure that everybody was on the same page, you know, with that, and, you know, just get some counsel on it to make sure that we all understood it. So I just wanted to mention that because it was just something really quirky, and it came up and we were like, oh my gosh, what is this? And so I don't know if other places have camps and if that's ever come up, but.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm glad you mentioned camps, because sometimes people think that because a camp is it could be seasonal, that it may not have to fall under FLSA, but there's specific calculations you have to do for camps that determine like the amount of receipts that they take in per year, how many months they're open, things like that. So some camps, I just also want to mention, some camps maybe fall under FLSA, some don't. So if you have questions, or maybe you haven't been complying with FLSA, paying overtime to hourly staff for, you know, camps or camp employees, I definitely recommend taking a look at that and maybe involving an employment attorney, just because, yes, volunteers can get very complicated, unpaid volunteers, but then also camps in and of themselves have different regulations potentially. So yes, camps are very complicated.
And Susan, you just had me think of another situation that we had come up recently, not at GCFA, but a group that we were working with. I was getting ready to bring that up too, Susan. Yes. So one situation was with volunteers. It was somebody that was actually on staff, but was volunteering in a different capacity. And you have to be really careful with that, because if an employee is an employee and doing something else, they were just not paying that person for doing work. And I believe it was a local church we were working with that was a daycare worker, but was helping out, kind of set up for meetings and things like that. You have to pay that person. Susan also brought up ministerial exemptions. So there is an exception out there for ministers, which we all probably know. If somebody's clergy, they don't get overtime, they fall under the exemption status. But it gets a little tricky and kind of murky when you were looking at like a youth minister, music director, things like that. So that's where it's really important to have a really good understanding of the job duties. Is the person performing sacraments? And if you're confused about it, to bring in an employment attorney, because it gets to be a little tricky, and that's where we're definitely living in the gray. And we can't make a blanket statement to say here, this is who's exempt and this is who's not. You really have to, on an individual case-by-case basis, look at what the job duties are. Are there other questions? I think the biggest takeaway here is to make sure that you have good time records of when a person is clocking in and out. If they're hourly, it should not be 8888 4444. Whether it's written down, whether it's electronic, it should be accurate time. You need to keep those records for approximately 3 years or more, and just making sure that you're having consistent practices. We did, of course, caution not to have too many specific questions. We are probably overly cautious, which is a good way to be. Everything can be discoverable. So we just want to make sure if you have anything you want to discuss, feel free to reach out to us and send us an email. One question, many of our staff are also church members and on conference level committees. Are you saying they need to be paid? No. If they're serving in a volunteer capacity on a committee, they don't need to be paid for that committee time. I'm specifically saying if it's a conference staff person that is, you pay them hourly, they're working at the annual conference, and then they're working at the conference and it's annual conference time, for example, and you have them setting out chairs for 2 hours. you would need to pay them for those 2 hours. But no, if you have conference staff that are serving on committees, you don't have to pay them for, those are considered voluntary committees or volunteer committees. Any other questions before we wrap up? You all are going to be done a little bit early today. Okay, I'm going to put in just, Lori.
Sorry. So if the person is part-time, it doesn't matter if they're exempt or non-exempt, and they want to take on a second position that is totally structured differently, can they be exempt or non-exempt in their regular position, but then independent contractor in the other position? I think the answer is no, but I wanted to make sure.
So, well, if it's for the same FEIN, you probably can't make them independent contractor and an employee for the same organization, even if they're doing different things. But I will say that the IRS has a 24-point questionnaire for independent contractors. If they meet all of that criteria, and they definitely would be an independent contractor, I would run that by an employment attorney, because I would say probably not, because it is so specific to make someone an independent contractor. And if they're already an employee, those two things could cross. There could be difficulty there. That's,
yeah. And the independent contractor piece is very tricky. As Tricia mentioned, you have that 24-point test. And also it's rapidly changing right now. We're already seeing with the new administration for not very long. I've already seen updates coming through that some of that might change, some of those regulations, which is an important point, is just remembering anytime there's new administration, you want to keep a check on any employment laws that may be changing, because in the first year, that's what we're going to see is several employment laws changing. So we want to stay on top of that. But the independent contractor piece can get really tricky.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if an employee works, like say at annual conference or something where they're really working for extra hours, because you kind of pay them for the hours to get there and less what their regular commute is, and then they're working there, for the whole day, and they want to have the next day or other time available to them to use versus getting paid for their, if it's an hourly employee, we're not able to offer that comp time, correct? Or am I?
so you wouldn't necessarily, it wouldn't be called comp time. If you want to
Oh.
adjust an employee schedule and say, I know you worked long days, Monday through Thursday, you can take Friday off and not be paid, and then you would still get like 40 hours in that week. You can adjust their schedule, on that basis, but you couldn't say, we're not going to pay you the overtime this week, but you can take a day off next week. You have to make sure their hours worked are within that week.
Okay, thank you.
And that's a really good distinction, Debbie, is that we see a lot of people doing that across the 2-week pay period. And you've really got to keep it in that 40-hour-a-week period. And we even say, because a lot of our annual conferences and agencies don't actually work a 40-hour work week. So if, for example, they're a 35-hour work week, we still tell employees you have to get permission to work beyond the 35 hours for that week. But overtime doesn't kick in until over 40 hours. So we still want permission at 35. And so you could still give them some of that time off. But yes, it definitely has to stay in that 1 week time period. It cannot split over the 2 weeks. Any other questions? I put in my email address. I did get some emails from our last session that we had, and I think I've responded to everybody from that one. So if you have any conversations that you want to have or questions that you want to have, feel free to send me an email and we can talk through those. Okay. Thank you all. I think we will be on tomorrow talking about just some overall best practices with employment law and office best practices. So we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you.